Good evening and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. It's good to see all of these people here for the second in our lecture series for 2006 on the first woman president. My name is Jonathan Earl. I'm a professor in the history department here at KU, and I also am associate director for programming here at the Dole Institute. This week there are two programs. There's tonight and there's one this Tuesday, February 14th at 7:30. We'll welcome trend spotters and pollsters Celinda Lake and Kellyanne Conway, who will tell us what women really want. There's also a part of their title that is a little more wordy that I'll read now, but I thought that would be enticing. How American women are quietly erasing political, racial, class, and religious lines to change the way we live. We at the Dole Institute view this as the perfect first stop on a great Valentine's Day date. And to sweeten the pot a little bit, we've teamed up with Ben & Jerry's on Massachusetts Street to offer the first 100 students at Tuesday's program a coupon that will get you 2 free ice cream cones. So students, please come. And that's, kindergarten, high school, college, it doesn't matter. Graduate students. The following week, Wednesday, February 22nd, we'll welcome 2 former presidential campaign managers to talk about how the first woman president will win. Tom Daffrin, who led Elizabeth Dole's 2000 campaign and is currently chief of staff for Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, and Mary Beth Cahill, executive director of Emily's List and John Kerry's campaign manager for 2004, will tell us how this is actually going to happen in our political system. That one starts at our usual time of 7:30, no free ice cream that night. Finally, to close out our series, I'm proud to suggest and let you know that we'll welcome 2 former woman governors and a nationally known political women's activist on Tuesday, February 28th at 7:30 p.m. to talk about what it's like to be a woman and be a chief executive. The numbers of women leading states, balancing budgets, and using the bully pulpit is, in my opinion, the most positive trend for women in politics, and it's happening outside the Beltway, not in Washington. Now for a formal introduction of tonight's featured lecture, I'm going to turn things over to Dole Institute Director Bill Lacey, which is good for everyone in this room because if I was doing the introduction, I would have subjected you all to my positively awful John McLaughlin impression. I think it's fair to say that Bill Lacey has taken this institute in entirely new and positive direction since he got here in September of 2004. We have numerous programs. We pack these houses, and it's really his leadership that's allowed us to kick it into a much higher gear at the Dole Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bill Lacey.
Thank you very much, Dr. Earl. It's great to see another full house tonight. It is really tremendous, the support that you're giving to this lecture series, and we're very excited to see you here. I would tell you that in terms of Q&A, we'll do Q&A after our speaker tonight the way we always do that. We will have 2 students or other staff members of the Institute who will have cordless mics, and if you'd like to ask Ms. Clift a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. And we always ask that you ask a question fairly quickly, make no speeches. We don't allow speeches except from the guest and, of course, the staff people like me and John. But anyway, we're delighted that you're here tonight. When we began planning this series last year, we had a pretty clear vision in mind. We wanted a series of programs, each conceived to cover a key element of the topic, the first woman president. And we developed a list of possible speakers for each of those topics. One program was called Madam President. But for this program, we only listed one person as an optional speaker because she wrote the definitive book on the topic. Needless to say, we were delighted when Eleanor Clift agreed to be part of the Dole Institute's presidential lecture series. Ms. Clift began her career as a secretary to Newsweek's national affairs editor. She shattered the glass ceiling and became one of the magazine's first secretaries to move to a reporting assignment. She served as White House correspondent during the Carter and Reagan presidencies. She and I were just trading notes. We were actually, I was in the Reagan White House during the first term when she was the White House correspondent there. And she also briefly filled the role of White House correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. She's had a number of other key roles at Newsweek, including covering President Clinton's '92 campaign, serving as congressional and political correspondent, and as deputy Washington bureau chief. She is currently the contributing editor and writes on a number of topics, including the influence of women in politics and the 2008 presidential contenders. Now, you may not know this, but Ms. Clift has played herself in movies including Independence Day, Rising Sun, and Dave. And in 1982, John McLaughlin, Ms. Clift, and others virtually created the practice of punditry on TV with a TV show, The McLaughlin Group. And Ms. Clift remains a panelist. And I promise, Eleanor, not to interrupt you at any time during your speech today. You can count on that. She's also a political analyst for Fox News. Ms. Clift has authored 3 books, including Madam President, written with her late husband. It is, as I said a few moments ago, the book on the topic, The First Woman President. Please join me in welcoming to the Dole Institute of Politics, Ms. Eleanor Clift. Oh, thank you.
Well, I must say I'm glad to be here, but as Bill pointed out, I'm glad to be anywhere where I get to finish a sentence without getting interrupted. I'm sure some of you do recognize me as typically the lone woman on the McLaughlin Group, which is a televised public affairs show, but it's really more like a televised food fight. It's the only show where you're expected to speak before you think, and interrupting each other, calling each other names, being generally rude is all considered part of good television today. The show is the creation of John McLaughlin, formerly Father John McLaughlin. He is a former Jesuit priest. And before coming to the world of television, he taught in a boys' prep school in Fairfield, Connecticut for a number of years. And I've actually met many of his students. And they describe him coming into the classroom in his long robe with a velvet rope around the middle, a Homburg, and white gloves. And every classroom had a beadle, B-E-A-D-L-E. It's an Anglican church term for the person who follows behind the bishop with the incense. And on the show, Pat Buchanan is the beadle. And so John would arrive in the classroom, take off the Homburg, and then with great flourish remove the white gloves finger by finger. And he once said to me that the best and the most memorable teachers are those that project themselves as characters. And it's actually what he does on television. He got his start in politics in 1970. He ran for the U.S. Senate in Rhode Island as a long-haired anti-war Republican priest. And for those of you who enjoy political trivia, the Democrat's name was John Pastore. And when Senator Ted Kennedy went in to campaign for his fellow Democrat, he reminded the voters that the Vatican had declared they didn't want members of the clergy running for political office or holding office. And he said, if this man wins, what would we call him? Would we call him senator? Would we call him father? This is inappropriate. And John's response, which is documented in the clips, was that you would think Senator Kennedy, with his reputation, wouldn't mind having a priest nearby. John got 36% of the vote, so the Republic was safe. But he came to Washington. His interest in politics was whetted, and he got a job as a speechwriter in the Nixon White House. And during that period, he had a special dispensation to live in the Watergate Hotel. And here's somebody who'd taken the vow of poverty. Watergate Hotel's pretty fancy. And if you ask him about that period, he will point out that the Vatican actually owns part of the Watergate, so it's really company housing. He was one of the last defenders of President Nixon before the president resigned, and from there he went into radio initially. And when I came to Washington in December of 1976, having covered Jimmy Carter, I knew of John as the crazy right-wing priest, is how he was known in my circles. And he got the idea for this television show, and the idea was that you would model this show after a men's locker room, and it would be like guys sitting around interrupting each other, one-upping each other, as my late husband used to say, lots of towel snapping. And it was a all-male group for a while. And then the issues began to change so that you really couldn't sit around with five white guys, talking about a lot of the issues of the day. And so I was invited on, and only occasionally initially. And John would actually say, you know, what can a woman tell me that a man can't? And I thought, oh, I'm never going to repeat that in public. And when the show had its 10th anniversary, we had to roast each other. And so I recall that line, and he laughed. He you know, John is from the school. As long as your name is mentioned, it's okay. But I do remember the first time I was dropped onto that set, and I felt like I was really in a totally alien environment. They were actually quite polite. They would let me speak, and then they simply would go back to what they were doing. They didn't engage me, and it wasn't until Bob Novak, who is known in Washington as the Prince of Darkness, would wag his finger in my face and say, "Eleanor Clift and people of her ilk," that I knew somehow I had been accepted. You have to learn how to interrupt on this show, because if you didn't interrupt, it would simply go by without you. And I've gotten pretty good at interrupting. I still struggle to hold the floor. I think if anybody is documenting interruptions on the show, I think it's pretty clear that they interrupt me a lot more than they interrupt each other. And hardly a show goes by that I don't say, you know, let me finish. I think it'll probably be on my tombstone. And I've also learned as a woman on television, you always have to keep a smile on your face. Even a neutral expression somehow comes across as angry, or the dreaded adjective shrill. So I smile a lot more than I actually feel. That smile is not always heartfelt. But I think part of my staying power on this show is that I have learned how to be a good sport, and I don't take it personally. And although I think politics is very important, there is, especially in Washington, a gamesmanship quality to it. And I have learned from the guys who they would go after each other hammer and tongue, and then 5 minutes later they're talking about the Redskins. And I think women, sometimes we tend to take things more personally. So I've had to learn how to get that thick skin. Somebody shook my hand out there and marveled that my hands weren't rougher than than they were. But I've learned how, I think, to be a good sport. And I think of myself as one of those inflatable dolls. You know, you punch me down and I'm going to come popping back up. But my experience, I think, in this what really has been a male-dominated talk show world has made me a natural ally of women in politics, and that's another area of life where women are underrepresented and really have to struggle to be heard. It's a struggle, however, that is yielding positive results, and I am here tonight to celebrate the progress that women have made in politics. We have not only female presidential candidates in theory, we have two actual possible candidates in Hillary Clinton and Condoleezza Rice. And when you suggest that we could have a woman president sometime soon, or to be safe, sometime this century, the century is young, nobody laughs anymore. It is not a laughing matter. And we have a female president on television in Gina Davis. Now, she's a political independent, and I actually, for those of you who are familiar with its television show Commander-in-Chief, and Gina Davis plays the president who is an independent who's been elevated to office when her running mate, who was a Republican, falls ill and dies. I think the political independent label is very important in today's politics. I think it really does reflect a yearning out there in the populace for candidates who can rise above the petty partisanship of the two-party politics. And in just about every episode, Gina Davis is doing something wonderfully ethical, shaming all of the mostly male politicians in the Congress. And she's also wielding military might and power in just about every episode, and of course for good ends. And I think, again, showing that a woman, should she become president, can, push the button and order troops as well as any a man can. So I'm a big believer in the fact that art prepares the path for life. And in real life, of course, we have had several positions that used to be typically only the province of males. We've had women. We've had 2 female secretaries of state, a female attorney general, a female national security advisor. And so the position of women today is very different even than it was in 1992, the year that we so proudly proclaimed the Year of the Woman, because a record number of women were elected to the House and the Senate. And I remember some male congressman was quoted saying there were so many women on Capitol Hill, the place was beginning to look like a shopping center. And it was Pat Schroeder, who I think has been speaking here in the past, who was the dean of the women serving in the House, and her comment was that she wondered where he shopped, because men still vastly outnumber women in the U.S. Congress. And by one measure, it will be 200 years before women reach parity in the House and Senate at the rate we're going. And yet there are 3 states now, Maine, Washington State, and California, that have 2 women senators, and Washington State has a female governor, and the men in the legislature in Washington State several years ago, I think, put a bottle of cider in a safe somewhere, and they call it's for the last man standing before he turns out the lights and lets the women take over. So there's a lot of this sort of jocularity about women, and that there is that element. Whenever women begin to make some progress, there's a lot of joking about how they really want to take over. As Bill noted in the introduction, I started at Newsweek as a secretary, and I owe my job to what I call the contemporary women's movement, which is, of course, now pretty ancient history to young people today. That was the women's movement of the 1970s. And I used to drive John McLaughlin crazy when I told him I was an affirmative action baby. But in fact, I am, and that middle-class white women were the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action. When I started at Newsweek, they were not hiring women to be writers or reporters. Not that I aspired to be one. I was just happy to be where what I typed was interesting, and that it didn't occur to me that my horizons could go beyond that. But there were women at Newsweek who thought very big, and among them Nora Ephron, who is a pretty famous movie director and screenwriter today. Ellen Goodman, who was on the Clift desk at Newsweek. Anyway, several women got together and they brought a class action suit against Newsweek for gender discrimination. And the magazine responded. Katharine Graham, who owned the Washington Post and which owned Newsweek, when she was told of the suit, she said, "Which side am I supposed to be on?" Because she was a woman and she was a manager. But Newsweek did the right thing, and we were represented, or I should say they were represented. I was too junior at the time, but Eleanor Holmes Norton, who today represents the District of Columbia in Congress, was just starting her career as a public interest lawyer. And she represented the women at Newsweek, who were, for the most part, the daughters of well-connected political figures and business figures in New York. And when the then editor saw the women of Newsweek and this African-American lawyer who happened to be pregnant with her first child, he saw this scene, he thought, maybe we ought to settle out of court, which is what Newsweek did, and they established a system of goals and timetables, and thanks to that, I did an internship and became a reporter, never having taken a journalism course, and also not having had a college degree. So I am really up from the bootstraps, I guess you could say. And so I have great reverence for the women who are out there and who have the courage to actually get into the arena, particularly the political arena. And last spring, I went to a 80-something birthday party for Betty Friedan, who, of course, passed away recently. And she was asked, where does the women's movement go next? And she actually threw up her hands and didn't say anything for quite a while, which is unusual for Betty Friedan. And finally she said, well, we did it. I don't quite think we've done it all, but it is very hard to define feminism today or to identify a woman's movement. And yet women are the crown jewel every political season. We as a group have enormous clout when it comes to politics. There are the soccer moms, the waitress moms, the security moms. It's always a segment of the voting population that each party courts. And in 1996, of course, if only men had voted, Bob Dole would have won the presidential race. So there's some irony to the fact that this series on a female president is sponsored at this Leadership Institute, and I really commend them. But the gender gap is what has elected Democrats, and when the gender gap is narrowed, as George W. Bush did in 2000 and in 2004, Republicans win. And candidate Bush did it in 2000 with his appeal to compassionate conservatism and many pictures taken with school children. I kind of thought maybe he could get his teaching certificate. He was pictured with so many children. And then in 2004, of course, it was the security fears which really brought women to his corner. This is a great time to be a woman, and yet I wonder why more women do not step up and run run for politics. I mean, women are taking their place in virtually every area of American life, to the point where Newsweek, my magazine, did a cover recently worrying about leaving boys behind. And Newsweek also did a cover earlier this year that was titled How Women Lead, and it pointed out that more than half college students today are female, and almost half of medical and, well, half, I guess, of medical and law school classes are women. And it's no longer a big deal when you see women in these prominent positions, and there's now a woman heading MIT, which is a technological institution. And so we are taking our place just about everywhere. And President Bush, like President Clinton before him, have really put women in positions of high profile. And I must say, I think that President Bush also tried initially, when he first took office, to raise the issue of the family concerns, which I think are a big obstacle to women making more progress in politics. There's a wonderful anecdote. When Bush was first elected, his chief of staff, Andy Card, was briefing all the new members of the White House staff, and he told Margaret Spellings, who was coming out of Texas and had worked with the school board in Texas, and she was coming in to work on domestic policy. And he basically outlined his expectations for the job she would do. And he said to her, "You'll be sleeping here." Well, she she hung up the phone, and she immediately called Karen Hughes, who was a buddy and, of course, is close to George W. Bush. And she said to Karen, are you doing this? She said, I can't do this. I'm a single mother. I have 2 children. I can't spend all my waking hours at the White House. And so Karen Hughes picks up the phone and calls then President-elect Bush and says, we can't live that way. And so Bush says, don't worry about it. As long as you've got a cell phone, I don't care how many hours you're physically there. And then he calls Andy Card and says, and here's the operative quote, "Quit scaring off my mothers." Now, the White House circulated this anecdote widely because they wanted women at the White House to know that they didn't have to fall into this workaholic trap, and they wanted that was part of the conservative, compassionate conservative image. Now, how realistic it is, I think not. Karen Hughes was gone pretty quickly. Her son wasn't happy in Washington. She's now come back and is at the State Department, and Margaret Spellings is now Education Secretary. And I think if you talk to anybody who works in this White House or any White House, they really are 16 to 18-hour days, and you can't really get around that, whether you're, male or female. But the fact is that this president tried to send the message that he cared about the concerns of women in the workplace. And when I talk to young women, their principal concern is how are they going to balance a family with a career. And last year, the New York Times had a story. They interviewed women at an Ivy League college, and they all were saying, despite these very expensive degrees and educations they were getting, when they had children, they would stay home. Now, the story was attacked as too anecdotal and reflecting just a small segment of society. But I'll tell you, it sent shockwaves through a lot of baby boom mothers who are seeing this play out in their children. The baby boom mothers worked and did it all, and they went through the supermom thing and everything, and now they are seeing their daughters not having this same ambition. And while you can say that's okay, and it might be for a number of people, one of the reasons they're not having the same ambition is because of the same conflicts that existed a generation ago, and that is who's going to take care of the children. So I think there are structural reasons why more women don't get involved in politics, and there are cultural barriers. But it's a very different world from 1984, when Geraldine Ferraro was the first woman to appear on a major party ticket. There was a very aggressive and organized women's movement then, and they really pressured the Democratic candidate, Vice President Walter Mondale. They pressured him to the extent that it was a real detriment for Mondale because he looked weak. He looked like he was capitulating to women's demands. And then the question about Jerry Ferraro, as I recall, was, is she tough enough? And some reporter then asked her about the demand that her husband release their tax returns, and Ferraro's husband had refused to release their tax returns. And Ferraro parried the question by saying, "You know how Italian men are." And that was a disaster because the stories were, if she can't stand up to her husband, how does she stand up to the Soviets? And the brouhaha over their tax returns consumed several weeks that should have been part of the campaign. And so I think after that election, the political professionals looked at this and said, this was a wonderful experiment in what it's like to have a woman on the ticket, and look what it got us. Ronald Reagan won 49 states. Well, if Jerry Ferraro were here, what she would say is, it was morning in America. That was the Reagan campaign slogan. And the Democratic ticket would have lost if God herself were on it. But she got blamed to a certain extent, and for whatever the reasons that election turned out the way it did, it left both parties skittish about the possibility of having a woman. Now, my husband and I published a book called Madam President, Shattering the Last Ceiling in 2000. And we set out to do the book on the assumption that a woman was going to be named on to the vice presidential slot in one or both of the major parties. By then it had been, 16 years since Ferraro? It seemed like it was time. and there were all kinds of women who were suggested to fill these slots, but it didn't happen. But in that book, we quoted political professionals saying that the candidate who will be for the first woman president will be a sister mister. In other words, she will be a woman, but she will run a campaign that will be virtually identical to a campaign that a man would run. This would not be a gender-centric campaign. And Frank Luntz, the sort of ubiquitous pollster, said, I think aptly, he said that the first woman president is going to have to be a combination of Mother Teresa and Jack the Ripper. And that is the need to be extra tough and yet fulfill the stereotype of your gender, and to be extra also warm and compassionate. Now, the qualities that voters look for in a chief executive: decisiveness, a commanding presence, even an ability to intimidate. These are not qualities that are typically associated with female candidates. And a study in voter attitudes towards women, called The Keys to the Governor's Office, concluded that the lack of toughness is the most difficult stereotype for women candidates to overcome. And we realized, as you look at all of the successful campaigns that women run, and I'm thinking specifically of Jennifer Granholm, who was elected the first woman governor of Michigan now almost 4 years ago, her campaign rhetoric, she was always fighting for the voters. She was fighting for families. It's not an accident that she used the aggressive verb. And when she was asked who her hero was, she said Margaret Thatcher. Now, Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, quite famously warned the first President Bush not to go wobbly on her when we were helping her with the Falklands War. And Margaret Thatcher did nothing for women's issues, and she did not respond like what we would think a typical woman would in office. She cut social programs. She did not name women to her cabinet, and yet nobody wondered about, was she tough enough? And so whenever people question whether a woman can be tough enough in office, all you have to say is Margaret Thatcher. So she did women a great service simply by being who she is. But these structural barriers, or you could almost call them cultural barriers, are out there, and family is first among them. I mean, women are still the primary caretakers in society, and many women do not enter politics until their children are grown, and so they're going to lose 10 or 15 years in building a career, because if you're going to run for president, you don't start at the top. You have to basically work your way up through the various offices. Now, I am seeing more women in the U.S. Senate and the House who are balancing young children with their political careers. Senators Mary Landrieu of Arkansas and Blanche Lincoln of Arkansas each have young children. And Kay Bailey Hutchison, God bless her, from Texas, at age 58, adopted 2 young children. So it can be done, and I think this, again, a lot of this, all of the more rigid barriers and the more rigid stereotypes are all changing. But I sometimes think you need a therapist to figure out why women aren't more prominently getting into the political arena, and a lot of it has to do with self-confidence. What we noticed in interviewing all the women we did for Madam President, that just about every woman in public office, when you ask how they got their start, if they were approached in some way, their initial reaction was, "You're crazy, I can't run for office." Whereas when men are approached, their reaction is, "What took you so long to discover me?" So there is a kind of a different way of looking at political life and your ability to handle it. I'm the co-chairwoman of a group called the International Women's Media Foundation, and we hold leadership seminars for women around the country. And I attended one in Miami recently, and I was struck by the fact that so many of the things of their complaints were universal. They wanted advice on how to reclaim their neglected personal lives, how to better negotiate office politics, and they wanted strategies for self-promotion so they could toot their horn just like the guys. And they were convinced they couldn't play politics as well as men. And you see that a lot. Women don't want to enter politics until it's cleaned up. It's never going to be cleaned up. You got to get in. You got to get in now. And women seem to struggle to be able to claim credit for themselves. And one woman told of having gone out to lunch with a male colleague who announced that in a year and a half he would be at the New York Times, which, despite the Times' problems, is still the holy grail of print journalism. And when he said this to her, she said, you know, it never occurred to me to think that grandly. And she said she wondered, you know, why that was. Gender differences and how they play out in the workplace are really what dominated the discussion among these women. I remembered one said that men grow up learning how to swagger. And she said, is there a female equivalent for the word swagger? And we couldn't come up with one. But when the talk seemed to veer too much to putting women on a pedestal, that somehow we were better, one city editor, you know, broke that bubble when she said that she didn't buy the notion that women were better or nicer as bosses. And she said, I'll bet everyone in this room has had at least one female boss who's a psycho. And that got a lot of knowing laughs, and one woman shouted out, more than one. So yes, that's a yes right over here. But now when you ask, though, where presidents come from, 4 of the last 5 presidents have been governors, and 5 of the last vice presidents have served in Congress. And so we have today, and not from the House of Representatives, we have 14 female senators out of 100, and we have 8 female governors out of 50. And of the 50, I think there are probably 2 or 3 that you could imagine having presidential ambition, and one of them, of course, is Kathleen Sebelius, the governor of Kansas. She comes from a political family. She's right. She's doing a good job. She was talked about somewhat as a possible running mate for John Kerry, but I don't notice her trekking up to Iowa and New Hampshire. And if you can count the number of male governors from a variety of states who are visiting Iowa and putting their toe in the water in New Hampshire and so forth. And so I don't know what kind of future ambitions Governor Sebelius has, but she is the kind of woman that you can imagine having prospects. It's very difficult still for women, though, to get elected governor. It is a higher hurdle. It is a chief executive's job. And women are having a much easier time getting into state legislatures and into the U.S. Congress because the voters think of those legislative bodies as debating societies. And they know that women, we know how to talk. They're not so sure that we can be, again, that toughness, tough about the budget, tough about law enforcement, tough about the military. And so it's also, I think, a problem for women in today's climate to understand that the voters may be more reluctant to elect a woman to lead the country because we are in a time of war. And it's no accident that Hillary Clinton is sitting on the Armed Services Committee and has visited Iraq a number of times and is trying to show that she has foreign policy credentials. And Condoleezza Rice, again, the other woman who is plausibly mentioned as somebody who could run for president. I mean, she's been the National Security Advisor, and she's the Secretary of State. And so those foreign policy credentials are all important. But even if you don't have all the requisite attributes to really think you can win the presidency, there are lots of reasons to run short of thinking you can actually win. You can bring attention to the issues that you can care about. You can elevate your national profile. And I know Carol Moseley Braun was just here, and she did both of those things when she entered the race for president. And her candidacy was actually quite controversial in the women's movement because she had been a one-term senator. There had been some ethical questions, and there was this ongoing debate, you know, should the first woman president, should people who are the pioneers, they have to be exceptional candidates. They have to be the female George Washington, the female Thomas Jefferson. Now, I actually think George Washington and Thomas Jefferson wouldn't look so good if they had to undergo the scrutiny of the cable news networks 24/7 and had Rush Limbaugh, etc., breathing down their neck. But, you know, having said all that, whatever the qualms were about Carol Moseley Braun's entry into the race, she handled herself exceptionally well in the debates. And I must say, watching her perform made me regret that Elizabeth Dole had bowed out in 2000 before the debates, because I think she would have handled herself very well in the debates. And if a Democrat had won in 2004, Carol Moseley Braun would have probably gotten a cabinet position. So while there was never any serious expectation she would win the presidency, getting into the race itself brings positive results for everybody. And she had one of the best lines. I don't know if she talked about this when she was here, but she had one of the best lines of the campaign when she said that the 2000 election was decided by the black vote, Clarence Thomas. And she's one of the few people who could say that. And I did a panel with her in New York at Barnard College, and she talked about how she got all the comments about her appearance, and she said, so many people said to her, "Oh, your hair, that bun is oh so tired." That was her words. And she said one of her supporters actually suggested she should see Reverend Sharpton's hairdresser. So she had a wonderful sense of humor about all this, and she was actually a very leavening influence on the campaign trail. If you could watch all those debates, and there were numerous, you could see that she was sort of a bridge between the various candidates. So again, you know, I think as women we have much to cheer about, but we need more than like one candidate per season getting into the race. But who would have believed in 1996 when Bill Clinton and Bob Dole ran against each other that their wives, Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Dole, would be serving side by side in the U.S. Senate, and their husbands would be in the Spouses Club. So progress is definitely being made. And in some ways, the country is really more ready to elect a woman than there are women in the pipeline who are prepared and known enough to actually run a national campaign. In the spring of 1998, there were focus groups, and women were asked who they would nominate to run for president. And three names came up consistently: Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Dole, and Oprah. Now, Elizabeth Dole tried, and Oprah I don't know about. That's still a possibility. But Hillary Clinton certainly we are talking about. And she is one of a very few women in public life who can plausibly run because she can raise money. And in our book, we said $25 million was the ticket of admission for a presidential race. Well, George W. Bush, I believe, raised $100 million in 2000 and $300 million for his primary race, and he had no opposition in 2004. And so Hillary Clinton's goal now apparently is to raise $100 million. I mean, and who has that kind of Rolodex? You know, not very many women at all. She gets high marks from her colleagues in the Senate. She's worked across the aisle with John McCain, with Lindsey Graham, with Rick Santorum, with Sam Brownback. The more conservative you are as a Republican, Hillary wants to be pictured with you. I mean, she's really trying to move her image to the center. And she doesn't have to prove her toughness. And what makes her, I think, leaderly, aside from her intellect, is the dignity and the grace with which she handled an extremely humiliating situation. She prevailed, and people respect that, even if they may disagree with her politically. There is a toughness about her. And I always remember a cartoon that ran in the Washington Times, which is a conservative paper in Washington, and it showed Hillary trying on a pair of pants before a full-length mirror, and then the little bubble that had the language from off the stage was Bill Clinton saying, "Hillary, have you seen my pants?" And now, the downside of that is, everybody thinks it's a zero-sum game. If Hillary succeeds, he loses. That's not necessarily how life operates. But she is regarded as somebody who is smart enough and tough enough, and those are two big hurdles to get over. I think her biggest problem is that even the people who support her, love her, think she'd make a great president, are scared to death that she can't win, and that it will be a year when the Democrats really could take back the White House, and that Hillary will lose it for them. And part of it is the woman thing. Do they really want to experiment now when it seems as though taking back the White House is so critical? And the second is Hillary Clinton isn't just any woman. She is the wife of Bill Clinton, and she is a rich target to replay all the scandals of the Clinton years. And even people who love the Clintons aren't so sure they want Bill Clinton back in the White House. So it's complicated. Now, I can argue it both ways. She has won over upstate New York, which is quite Republican, and she's done it by listening to their concerns and not getting away from the social issues and dealing with economic concerns. But, she also may be so polarizing that she would not be able to win a single red state, and Democrats need to do that in order to win. They do not give away a presidential nomination, so Hillary will have competition. And ironically, if the Iraq War is still as major an issue as it is today, she may face opposition from the left because she supported the war. She's been rather hawkish on the war. And when you look at somebody who could run from the left, don't laugh now, but Al Gore's name comes up. And I think he plausibly has the name recognition, and he could plug into the Democratic activist network. And now a primary contest between Bill Clinton's wife and his vice president is a nightmare, I think, for Democrats, but it is not out of the question. On the Republican side, Condoleezza Rice, she certainly has the credentials to run. She says she's not interested, that it's not her calling, and I actually take her at face value. I can't quite imagine her getting into the primaries and duking it out, and she's not a favorite of the right wing of the party. She's pronounced herself mildly pro-choice, but more than that, she's an academic, and before she got into Russian studies and politics, she was going to be a concert pianist. I mean, she's a brilliant woman. She was a child prodigy, but I don't know that she has the fire in the belly that you would need to run for the presidency. But having said all that, she would make a wonderful running mate for whatever Republican got the nomination. And again, in the book we wrote, we suggest that the most likely route for the first woman president would be through the vice presidency. And so I think that would be more likely for Condoleezza Rice. But if you want to find other women who are credible potential presidential candidates, they're out there. Heather Wilson, Republican from New Mexico, 45 years old, graduate of the Air Force Academy. She served with distinction, Rhodes Scholar. She just was in the news this week because she's challenging the president on the eavesdropping program. She's also in a very tough race with the woman running against her who's the Attorney General of New Mexico. Whether she survives or not, I don't know. And I don't know whether she even has the interest in going further, but that is the kind of woman. I mean, that is a resume to die for if you're interested in the presidency on the female side. In our book, we tried very hard to identify future candidates. And we zeroed in on Christy Todd Whitman, who'd been elected governor of New Jersey twice, moderate on economic issues, progressive on social issues. We thought the perfect mix for today's world. George Bush puts her in the cabinet, and she clashes on environmental issues, and right now I think her political future is zero. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend was supposed to win the governorship of Maryland. Instead, she loses, and there went another seemingly good prospect. And a woman named Emily Couric, who was Katie Couric's older sister, was a state senator in Virginia, was aiming for the governorship and looked like she could go all the way. She got pancreatic cancer and died at a very young age. And so the point of those stories is that you've got to have a lot of women in the pipeline in order to really have a shot at the presidency. And having just one as an oddity every 4 years is, I don't think that does the trick. And when Gina Davis accepted the Golden Globe and told the story that on her way into the theater, a little girl had said to her, because of you, I know I could be president. And then Gina Davis confessed, well, that didn't really happen, she said, but it could have. And the fact that it could have means that it will very soon. And I'm optimistic that I am going to see a woman president in my lifetime, and I'm not going to make it to the next century. So I want to leave you with that thought, and I also would like to, in the time remaining, take whatever questions that you might have. Thank you. Can I just call on? Yes.
What do you think of this mean thing with Hillary? Where they're calling her mean?
The mean thing. The Republican National Committee Chairman, Ken Millman, remarked on how angry Hillary is, and Maureen Dowd, New York Times columnist, did a column on who was more hormonal, Dick Cheney or Hillary Clinton. And I don't know how many of you got the news this afternoon, but Dick Cheney accidentally shot one of his hunting partners. He sprayed pellets on him when he was going for quail. And it's a 78-year-old gentleman. He's in the hospital. He's going to be okay. Now, what can we women say about that? Temperament will probably be an issue. And I think, if I take the question seriously, I think people who know Hillary and her staff, the people who work for her would walk over broken glass for her. And she is much warmer in small groups. When she gets on television, there's almost like a mask that comes on. And there's not a warmth that comes out. Now, do we need that? And I think you could argue that Al Gore and John Kerry were not really warm, didn't connect, and they didn't win. And so there are some worries there. But then when you look also at 2000 and the race between George W. Bush and John McCain, and there were comments made about John McCain's temperament that became an issue. And so, this is done in politics, and I think probably it will be attempted about Hillary or whoever. Their personality will be taken into account. And in a larger way, the Democrats can't just go out there and criticize everything and be downers. Ronald Reagan showed us how that optimism can really take you a long way. And the American people you need to criticize them, but people who just have a negative message usually don't do very well. So you have to have a can-do spirit of optimism, and I'm sure she's aware of that. So.
Carol Moseley Brown made a strong point about the difficulties in raising money for a campaign. Is being a female a factor in that, or is it just some kind of organizational issue?
That's a good question. I think it is an organizational issue. It has to do with what your chances look like. If you look like you can be a winner, you're going to have an easier time raising money. And you're going to have an easier time raising money if you're in a political position where you can do people favors once the campaign is over, even if you don't win. And, you know, again, I followed Elizabeth Dole's campaign. Now, you would think Elizabeth Dole, given who her husband is and how long she's been in public life, she could raise money. She had a terrible time raising money. At one point, they were selling off the floral centerpieces at lunches just to get, you know, cab fare to get to the next event. Because once that campaign was over, if Elizabeth Dole didn't win, she wasn't going back to the Red Cross, and that necessarily wasn't going to win her any favors anyway. When Bob Dole, her husband, ran, not necessarily, well, I guess he actually stepped down from the Senate. I'm thinking of John McCain. When John McCain ran, he was going to go back to being Commerce Committee chairman. So there was a reason to curry favor with him beyond the presidential race. So that has something to do with it as well. And then with Clinton, the fact that she is such a money machine has to do, it's part of the rock star status that she and her husband have. Second, they have a network out there of operatives that can, you know, really jingle the cash. But she is unique. I'm trying to think other women in public life. I imagine Condi Rice could raise money. Dianne Feinstein in her heyday could have raised money. I think her time has passed. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, if she had endured, could have plugged into the Kennedy network. But you know, once you get beyond that, it's hard to think of women who can really command the cash the way some of the male candidates can.
What do you think of Nancy Pelosi as a possible presidential candidate?
Too liberal, too West Coast. I don't see any inclination on her part. I mean, she right now, she'd love to be Speaker, and if the Democrats capture the House, she would be Speaker. But the talk you hear now on Capitol Hill is if the Democrats only pick up 2 seats or something, she's probably not going to have her job anymore. Now, if she comes close to taking back the House, but doesn't get there, and she's forgiven because of all of the gerrymandering, and it's just impossible, she's probably continues in her job. But I don't hear any talk about her as a presidential candidate. Democrats go through a perennial debate about whether they should move more to the left and energize the base, or whether they need to move more to the center. I think Hillary Clinton has clearly decided that she's got to, in some ways, take the nomination for granted and assume liberals will stick with her, and she's got to play to the broader country. And if you look at John McCain, I think he is playing clearly to the broader country. I mean, Republicans are actually his worst group. Independents love him. He's every Democrat's favorite Republican, and so I think the 2 leading candidates, Clinton and McCain, are playing to the middle of the country. And I don't, a liberal like Pelosi, and I don't think she would get in. If a liberal does get in, it would be the Wisconsin Senator Russ Feingold, and even he, I think people would see it as a symbolic effort and an effort to pull the party more to the left, but not necessarily that he would prevail. And I think for Nancy Pelosi, the party would consider it suicidal if she got in, not only for her, but for the party as well. The San Francisco Democrat label would get affixed.
Eleanor, my name's Mary O'Halloran, and 5 years ago you were here and you encouraged me. I was on talk radio and under a little stress from the far right. Now I'm on public television in Kansas City in the Eleanor Clift seat in a show that's modeled after John McLaughlin's show.
Great.
It's called Ruckus on Channel 19 in Kansas City. I'm grateful to you for your support.
Oh, good. Well, I don't know if I mentioned, John McLaughlin has actually shifted politically a great deal.
I was going to ask you that question.
Well, he was a columnist for the National Review, and he did work in the Nixon White House. But first of all, he does not support the war, and I think part of that is he comes out of more of the Republican Party tradition of isolationism.
Right.
2, he's a Jesuit. They don't like war. And 3, he's traveled in that part of the world, and he, I think, has just got some common sense about it. Secondly, he's not an admirer of President Bush. I mean, Ronald Reagan was his president, and lastly, he thinks that the party's, emphasis on the social issues is just way overdone. And he and Pat Buchanan argue about that off camera. It's really quite funny.
I appreciate your comments on that. I would like to, secondly, ask you if you would give some a little commentary about what you think liberal means today. I mean, Hillary certainly is other than about the war, as liberal as most people could be on social questions. But what is the perception and the reality, and is there a difference?
I think that the perception, the negative perception, is that liberals want peace at any price, and they'll tax you. They'll raise your taxes. Those are the 2 negative things, and the first one is left over from Vietnam, that Democrats are not, strong on national security, and the whole tax thing is I don't know, that goes back a long time. Remember Walter Mondale standing up at the convention and saying, Ronald Reagan was going to raise your taxes. The difference between the 2 of us is I'll tell you and he won't. But those are the negative images. I mean, the positive image of liberal is progressive and being, being open to ideas and not being inflexible and being inclusive and more caring about social programs and that sort of thing. But the Democrats do have to prove themselves on national security, and I think they do that not by running away from the fight, but by standing up to President Bush and saying, this is why you can't eavesdrop without getting a court order. You're not a dictator. 2, we think your policy in Iraq is creating a worse situation of terrorism. It's not making us safer. I mean, they have to engage him and not just let him get away with it. And then they have to go after him on this administration on competence and management. Whatever you think of the war, whether you are for it or against it, you cannot say it's been ably executed. It has been a disaster. Second, the handling of Katrina and the aftermath was another classic mismanagement. This president has rolled up more debt in 5 years than all 42 presidents before him taken together. And so the fiscal management is not good. So I think competence and management have to be part of the Democratic message, along with proving themselves strong. And the president's advantage on fighting terrorism, he had a 35-point advantage until maybe a year or so ago. It's now a 5-point advantage. 5-point advantage is still significant, however, but the Democrats can't run away from that and think they're going to run on purely domestic issues, because people care mostly about being safe. And I don't think that people think that Bush is doing that great a job, but they're not turning to the Democrats and saying, we think you can do an equal job or a better job. And until that happens, Democrats are not going to win elections. So it's a very pivotal time in Washington, because there's a lot of dissatisfaction with Bush and this administration, not only among Democrats, but among Republicans. And yet there's a lot of dissatisfaction with Democrats, among Democrats, because they haven't been able to articulate a clear message. Nobody knows what the Democrats stand for.
Right here. Thanks. There's been such a tradition in Europe for several decades to have women much more represented in high levels of government, and they've been electing presidents and prime ministers and now a chancellor. Why do you think it's been that they've had this tradition for several decades and the U.S. has lagged so far behind?
Well, a lot of these countries have different systems, and a parliamentary system, you only have to win in your particular area, and the winner-take-all system in this country is difficult. And politics is about the only area of American life where men and women go directly head-to-head. I mean, sports are segregated by gender. Even the Academy Awards are segregated by gender. And so for a long time, politics has been considered a men's sport. Remember, women didn't get the right to vote until 1920, and my most recent book is about the battle for the 19th Amendment and suffrage, when I had no idea that it was a 72-year battle, and that women were jailed and force-fed. And Alice Paul, the young woman who challenged the Wilson administration, they actually tried to commit her to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which is a mental health hospital in Washington. They tried to commit her for having an unhealthy obsession with President Wilson. They couldn't get away with it, but nonetheless they tried. And so, women are relatively, new to the political arena in this country, and having to, win the 50.1. Margaret Thatcher, won her little district, and then the story is that she went around and said to all the guys, I'm not going to when they were electing the party leader, prime minister, that she wasn't going to win on the first ballot, so they should vote for her, and then their candidate could succeed in a later ballot, and she won. So, so she pulled a fast one, and then of course in countries like Pakistan, and it's class and family connections in a lot of places, and so I think in Germany, Angela Merkel. Now that's. I think that was a significant breakthrough that she won, and we are seeing breakthroughs, certainly in Latin America. I think we're getting there in this country, but we're certainly not there yet. And I'll tell you, if Hillary Clinton does get the nomination, we're going to see one vicious campaign.
We have time for one more question.
General Wesley Clark? Okay. He ran the last time, and he proved that he was too green, I think, and he didn't handle himself that well. But Wesley Clark is clearly in there. I spoke with somebody who had lunch with him recently and said that he has a problem with Iraq because his position is essentially stay the course. And while maybe that's a responsible position, that's not going to win you the Democratic nomination. But it looks to me like he is going to get in it. And, let's just fantasize here. Suppose Hillary Clinton does get the nomination. He wouldn't be a bad running mate because he would bring the military thing. So I think, he's still somebody to watch, definitely.
In Washington, D.C., what was the ultimate feeling that Sandra Day O'Connor's seat didn't go to another female?
Just as there's no particular groundswell out there, I don't think, to elect a woman candidate. I think it's wonderful that we're getting together tonight to talk about it. But it's not like there are really a bunch of organized grassroots groups out there. And while Laura Bush articulated it would be nice to have a woman, when we got Harriet Miers the first time out, that I think got Bush off the hook to some extent, that he had tried to get a woman. And the people who would most normally agitate for a woman would be coming probably from the Democratic side and the progressive side. And when they looked at the available women who were being considered, they were all so far to the right of Harriet Miers that women were scared to death to advocate for a woman. And the pressure to get the requisite women or to bring more women in there, it's not there like it once was. And so I don't think Bush suffered any political damage for naming a male to the seat. But having said all that, I think this president really wanted maybe still wants Iraq to be his legacy, but that looks like it may not work out like he intended. The court is his legacy, and he is definitely fulfilling his campaign promise to name justices in the tradition of Clarence Thomas and Anthony Scalia. And Sam Alito's nickname, of course, as a judge has been Scalito because he has been so traditionally conservative. So It's interesting. This court, I think we're going to be talking about the Bush court for a good long while, and he may yet get another appointment because the most liberal member of the court is 86 years old. He's doing well, but, you know, that may be something that's out of everybody's control. So this president's legacy will be around for a good long while. Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate being here.